Welcome to today's webinar, Compensation in FCS Express 6. I'm Kaya Ghosh, a Technical Application Specialist with Novo software. Also on the line we have Andrea Val, who is based in Europe, and he is an expert on all things FCS Express and can certainly help you out with your questions about compensation. So if you do have a question, like I said, feel free to enter those in to the questions and answer box right here in the lower right corner of my layout. Okay, and we will be able to answer those either verbally during the course of the webinar, or if it's too complex or it's slightly off topic, no problem. We'll follow up with you either in the questions and answer chat window or offline. Okay, so hopefully what I'll show you today is that compensation really has a lot of different options. There's a lot of functionality for you, and you should be able to basically do anything that you want to do in FCS Express. So what we're going to do today is show you that FCS Express can read your compensation from any commercially available cytometer. It can modify this compensation, and you can also create a new compensation from scratch using your single stain controls and your unstained control if you have one. So briefly, in this webinar, we're going to show you how to view and edit existing acquisition-derived compensations, how to create a new post-acquisition derived compensation, and how to apply a compensation matrix or even multiple compensation matrices to the experimental samples in your layout. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first layout I want to show you is this layout where we have a comparison between FCS 2.0 format data files and FCS 3.0 format data files. So modern cytometers, almost without exception these days, are exporting the latter, the FCS 3.0 or 3.1 data files. Okay, but FCS Express can read version 2 data files as well. But FCS 3.0 or 3.1 data files are really what you want to work with if you have the choice. And the reason there, well, there's lots of reasons, but the most germane reason that I'll mention today is that the compensation is written to the metadata as a keyword, and it can be modified or removed. Whereas with FCS 2.0 data files, which are here at the top, although they can be compensated during acquisition, that compensation is written directly into the data and cannot be modified or removed. Okay, so let's take a look at the differences here and how you can see that metadata in FCS Express. So let's take a look at the left column to start off with. So the left column, I've highlighted both of these plots here on the left. In the top we have an uncompensated data file, and the bottom we have also an uncompensated data file. And then, whereas if I look at the right-hand column, so these ones here, these are both compensated, okay? But the difference is up top we have a 2.0 data file, and on the bottom we have a 3.0 data file. Now if I right-click here on the 3.0 data file and go to compensations, and we can see that the matrix that was defined at the time of acquisition using single stain controls, and then it's associated with the data file during the export of the raw data files from the cytometer machine. We can click on that compensation and see the matrix that was exported, okay? And that is going to be imported directly by FCS Express. And so since it's an external keyword, I can actually change it. You can probably see the plot on the bottom updating. Maybe I'll make a more obvious change so you see the populations jumping. Okay, so you see I can reduce or increase the compensation as I see fit. Okay, let's cancel out of that. Whereas with FCS 2.0 data files, such as this plot in the upper right corner of my layout, even though this is clearly a compensated data file, you can tell by eye, there is no external compensation matrix. See, I click on compensation and there's nothing there, okay? So you can also look for those keywords here in the file header, this view header command, and we'll click on all keywords. And if I scroll down, you can see that this spill keyword right here contains the compensation info. Okay, we actually do have a webinar. We've had webinars in the past about keywords. There's all kinds of metadata that's associated with your files. The one that you're most familiar with is the file name. There's other ones you might have heard of, like sample name, tube name, etc., depending on what your cytometer is. They all have different preferred keywords. But this is one keyword, the spill. It's usually called spill. Sometimes it can be called spillover. That's going to be exported with your FCS 3.0 or 3.1 data files if you've created a compensation at the time of acquisition. Okay, whereas if I right-click here on this plot on the left, which is also a FCS 3.0 data file, and I click on compensation, there's nothing there. So this is a compensation. This is a compensation-free FCS 3.0 data file. Okay, whereas this FCS 2.0 data file in the upper right corner, although it's compensated, I can come up here to view header, and let's look and see if we find any metadata. So I'm going to scroll all the way down, and I don't see a spill or a spillover keyword. Okay, so that means although that is a compensated data file, again, like I said, that compensation is written directly into the data, and so if you've by chance overcompensated your data, there's really no way to remove that in FCS 2.0 data files. However, if you have uncompensated FCS 2.0 data files or undercompensated, you can nonetheless create a post-acquisition compensation using your single stain controls in FCS Express. Okay, so what I'm going to show you how to do is how to create that post-acquisition compensation using our automatic compensation tool. And again, that can be then applied to FCS 2.0 or 3.0 data files. So before I advance to that next step of creating a compensation from controls, do any of you have any questions about the difference between 2.0 and 3.0 data files? Okay, great. So let's jump ahead. So, I'm going to start with a new layout, so that way you'll see how easy it is to start from scratch. Okay, so let's open up our compensations tool, and that is here on the Tools menu, Compensations, and now we get this window that you can move around. You can put it on a secondary monitor, wherever you want. I'm just going to dock it here on the left so it stays out of the way. Okay, and this compensation window has these little buttons at the top. And if you mouse over them, they give you a hint about what to do. So you need not memorize all the little steps. Just look at the hover text. You see that this blue plus says add a new compensation. And then you have this 5-step workflow that opens up. And I hope that this isn't too small for some of you to read. But basically, step 1 is loading in your single stain controls and your unstained universal negative if you have one. Step 2 is going to build the histograms automatically, so you can put markers around the positive and negative compensations, negative populations rather. And step 3 and step 4 are optional. I'm going to come back to those later because I would say 95 to 99% of the time a typical workflow doesn't include those, but we will go over what they're useful for afterwards. And step 5 has FCS Express automatically calculate the matrices for you. Okay? So, and I see a question about can we change the compensation of 2.0 data files by creating new compensations? You can add a compensation to it, but you cannot remove the pre-acquisition or the during acquisition compensation that was applied. Okay, so again, I would suggest that this is really the way to go. This is the most objective way to create a compensation. Earlier I showed you the little sliders in that other layout I had open, and while that is handy for like tweaking the compensation a little bit, and I know we all do it from time to time, as you all know, that's not the most scientific or objective way to analyze your data. So it's highly recommended that you do acquire single stained and unstained controls and create a compensation in this manner instead. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. Again, these mouse over hints are here for you. So let's add the data, add the compensation controls to my auto compensation tool here. Okay, so these are all my single stained and my unstained control. Okay, so now we're going to tell FCS Express what every parameter is. And in this case, it's easy because the parameter is actually saved in my file name. So let's use these drop-down menus to assign these. And as I'm doing this, just to drive the point home, this really is the best way to do your data analysis, because by doing so, FCS Express in the final result is going to align the median of your negative population with the median of the positive population in the spillover channel. So that's much better done mathematically than trying to do it by eye, which usually results in a subjective matrix that can be measurably different from the automatically created matrix. And I'm almost done here, getting there. This last one here is my unstained control, so I'm going to scroll down and select universal negative. So then if you click build histograms, as long as you don't have a parameter mismatch and as long as everything is matching up, you don't have any missing parameters, etc., you will get this ready to build histograms for auto compensation message. So let's click that, build histograms. Okay, so what this has done is it has created a parent scatter gate. Maybe I'll zoom in so you can see the gating hierarchy a little bit better. And under that parent scatter gate, it's created a stained and an unstained marker on histograms for each of the parameters in your experiment. Okay, and we'll get to those parameters in a moment. They're in these page tabs on the bottom. But let's just first start out with the scatter gate. FCS Express is going to automatically create the scatter gate on parameter 1 and parameter 2 of your data file. In this case, the user has acquired forward scatter area and forward scatter height, and so it's defaulted to the wrong parameters, essentially, for the scatter gate. So let's change this to side scatter, and that way we can draw the gate around the actual population that we want to apply the compensation to. Okay, and I'm not going to create a new gate. I'm just going to click this second option here to replace an existing gate, and we'll replace that original scatter gate. Okay, and the advantage of doing that is once you replace it, all of the child markers that are underneath that original scatter gate are still there in your hierarchy, and you don't have to fool around with the logic of your hierarchy. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at our stained and unstained populations, and let me zoom back out so we can see both of these plots. Okay, so at the top we have a APC stained control, and at the bottom we have our unstained control, our universal negative. And FCS Express has auto recognition of peaks, and in most cases that is going to be fine for you. But sometimes the marker just recognizes the shoulder of one of the peaks. So if you like, you can extend this so it encompasses the whole peak, because that's traditionally what people feel comfortable doing. But I just want to note that if you had left the marker how it was, that would have been fine too, because this would result in compensating your brightest against your dimmest, which is technically all you need to do. So let's go check the other parameters and see if we want to adjust any other markers. Seems to be good. Okay, that's looking good. And And that's fine, but I'll just adjust it for fun. Okay, so again, I'm going to come to adjust parameters and spillover targets later on. Well, I guess I'll just mention a little bit what they do in case some of you have a question. So adjust parameters is useful if you have mixed controls in your experiment. So if some of your compensation controls were cells and if some of them were beads, you could introduce extra plots or change your gating hierarchy and then just drag the appropriate markers or gates to these unstained columns to override these automatically created markers. Okay, I actually have an experiment. I have an experimental layout later on that I'll open up and show you how that's done. But again, I'm skipping that for now because I just want to go through the most typical workflow with you. And again, this is another optional step here. The fourth step is called add extra spillover targets. And that's probably not going to be used by, I would guess, 99% of you or more. But just to mention what it does is if you want to see what the hypothetical spillover would be in other channels, that's what can be used to see that. Okay, so let's jump ahead to step 5, which is our final step, and that is to calculate the matrices. So I'm just going to leave this on median because that's traditionally what you do, but if you'd like to do mean, you could always do that. And again, this is going to align the medians of the negative population with the median of the positive population in the spillover channel. So now you see we have a new compensation that's been created. Okay, you can see it up here in the upper pane of the compensations window. And we also have a spillover matrix down here. And we also have the compensation matrix, which, as you know, is the inverse of the spillover matrix. All right, so that's been automatically created by FCS Express. We could even insert those matrices in the text box on our layout. So let's grab the compensation matrix first. Okay. You can redrag these columns so it looks aligned a little bit nicer. Oops. Okay, and we will put in another text box and put in our spillover matrix right beside it. So I'm just dragging and dropping this over to the text box. Okay, and these inserted on your layout are live. So if you were to, for instance, change the compensation matrix, keep an eye on the value here, the PE versus PC7. You can see that it's changing in the table right here. Okay, it's this highlighted cell right there. Okay, but I'm going to undo that a couple times. I don't really want to mess with my matrix here. Okay. So that's all well and good. We've now created a matrix. And do you have any questions about that before I advance to the next point in the webinar? If you do have any questions, just feel free to enter them into the questions and answer box. Okay, so now let's find out how do we apply this compensation matrix to our experimental files. Well, there are several ways to do that. And the first way I'm going to show you is just putting your experimental data files in the same layout that we have our compensation files, and just working with everything in the same layout. And I see a question, what is the auto compensation setup? That is, if you click on it, you can just come back to the 5-step process and change anything that you want, and then you would just click calculate matrices again and it'll refresh the values. Okay, so let's open up our data list. I believe that I have other experimental files in here that we can use to demonstrate applying the compensation matrix. Okay, so these first 6 files are our stained and unstained controls. So let's just insert a plot of our actual experimental data files, okay? And these happen to lack compensation altogether. Let's align these so they look kind of nice. Oops. Okay, so how do we apply this compensation? One easy way is by dragging and dropping. You can just drag this new compensation over to the plots. Before I do that, let me just change the parameter on all of these because right now we're just looking at scatter parameters. Let's change this to PC5 versus PC7. That way the change will be really obvious when we apply the compensation, okay? Okay, so you see that this is probably some of you who are used to working with flow files quite a lot. You can see by eye that this clearly is uncompensated data at the moment. So let's drag a compensation over and see how that changes. So I can drag this over like this, okay? And you see that that middle plot has become compensated. Okay, I'm going to undo that and show you another way. You can either right-click, Format, and go to the Overlays category. And change the compensation from here. Okay, you see that got compensated. Let me cancel. Another thing you can do is highlight all of these plots and come up to the Format tab, Overlays, and use that drop down to affect the change on multiple samples at once. Okay, I'm going to undo that once more and show you one more way that you can do that. You can right-click on the compensation in the compensations window and click on Apply to All Plots. Okay, and you see now all 3 of those plots have had the compensation applied. Okay, let me undo that and demo Apply to Selected Plots. And in order to do that, I'm going to put in, just for the purpose of illustration, an unrelated data file so you'll see when that's useful. Okay, so if I put in, for instance, this file up here, and this is a totally different file. It's got a different set of parameters, so we don't want to apply the compensation to this per se. Okay, let's actually change this to maybe CD4 versus CD8. Okay, so in this case, let's say we only want to apply the compensation to these 3 plots that are going diagonally. So I can right-click and click Apply to Selected Plots. Okay, and now you see I could right-click on any of these plots and just show you that that compensation, which is called New Compensation by default, you can always change the name if you want to, has been applied to the plots. Okay, whereas on this unrelated data file, since we didn't select to apply it to that one, this one still has the acquisition-derived compensation. Okay, you see that it's named identically to the data file. Okay, and just to show you, let's go back to the auto compensation setup. When you apply the compensation to your data files that are in the same layout as your compensation matrix, you can actually adjust the matrix here by using these up and down arrows. Just keep an eye on the plots at right. You see they're moving when I do that. Or you could even enter in a value manually. Maybe I'll enter in 0.2. Okay, but again, that's not recommended It's not the recommended method, since the whole point of doing the auto compensation is to do this objectively. But I'm showing you that just in case there are some instances when you might want to know theoretically how populations look. Okay, so let's delete all these plots. I'm going to show you another way to apply compensations, and I see one person is actually asking a question about that, and that is using the set as default. That's correct. You can right-click on a compensation and set it as default in the layout, okay, and then default, you're going to see it to the right of the compensation. And before you insert plots, it's best to, in that case, change the preference or the default option for applying your compensations. Okay, so let's go into our preferences, which you can do down here at the bottom. So preferences are user-wide default options for how you want FCS Express to behave. And right now I'm logged in as a user called CW. Maybe I will show you exactly where that is, right here. You can click there to enter, to access your preferences, or if you find it more intuitive, you could go to File, Options, down here towards the bottom. Okay. So here we're going to change our preferences. So there's several different default preferences or options you can use. The manufacturer setting, i.e. the setting that it'll come FCS Express comes shipped to you, is FCS file then compensation default. And what that means is FCS Express will first try to load the compensation that is associated with your FCS file at the time of acquisition, i.e. your acquisition-derived compensation. And if none is available, it'll try to load the one that you manually set as default. Okay, so what I'm going to do is change this preference to the reverse of that. See, this last option is called compensation default then FCS file. And what that is going to do is allow me to, it will allow you to load the compensation default, the one that we just right-clicked and set as default as our first choice. And if there was none available or you hadn't set it, then it'll load in the FCS file derived, acquisition-derived compensation. Okay, there's a few other ones here. Probably some of them are self-explanatory at this point. So compensation default basically totally disregards the FCS file derived compensation from acquisition, whereas FCS file only tries to load that and will ignore anything that's set as default. None is useful if you have multiple compensations in the same layout. Like let's say you have multiple post-acquisition compensations and you want to apply post-acquisition compensation 1 to the first 3 samples, and then you have 3 or 4 other samples on another page that need an entirely different compensation. None is useful because then whatever compensation you put into the plot, for instance by dragging and dropping or going to format overlays, it won't change. Even if you click next, previous, batch process, change files, it'll just stay a static compensation in that plot no matter what data file is loaded into it. Okay? Hopefully that's not too confusing. I know it's a lot of different options, but keep in mind they're all there just to afford you the flexibility you need for different experimental designs. If you have any questions about what's best for your particular working scenario, just email us at support@denovosoftware.com, or just even send us a note here in the chat window and we'll get back to you later and we can discuss what's best for you. Okay, but let's get back into our workflow here. We're going to choose compensation default then FCS file. Okay, and so now when I load in my data list, I'll load in a file from my data list here. And again, let's change these to those parameters we were looking at before. You see, if I right-click and go to compensation, this new compensation has automatically been applied. I didn't have to drag and drop. I didn't have to do anything to apply it. The default's just automatically applied because that's the default option or preference that I have in place. Okay? And this is really good for batch processing because as I advance through my layout, so let me zoom in so you can see the title change in this plot. Now I look at data file 2, and again, that compensation is there. New compensation. Okay, data file 3, it's also there. So I would say that that is a good way to go if you're going to do a batch process, because that way as you advance through your data files, that compensation default will be there. But let me just note, if you have a compensation defined at the time of acquisition, there's nothing special you have to do, even if you're doing a batch process. The manufacturer default preference will take care of you just fine. Okay? All right, so let me show you another way that you can work with your compensations. Let's say you have this compensation, you're really happy with it, and you want to save it for future use. You have another set of files that you want to apply it to, but those files are at a completely different layout. Well, you can do that in FCS Express too, simply by exporting this compensation and importing it into a new layout. Okay, so let's do that. You can just right-click on the compensation and click on Export. So I'm going to put this on my desktop so I can find it. If this is something you think you're going to do often, you can create a little library of compensations on your desktop or somewhere where you'll be able to find it. But I'm just going to call this webinar compensation so I can recognize it on my desktop. And it's going to be saved as a .compensation file, as you can see at the bottom. Okay, now let's open up a layout that doesn't have any compensation in it. These data files probably look familiar to you at this point. Whoops. Okay, so you see in my compensations upper pane, there's nothing loaded. So these data files don't have any compensation that's associated with them from the time of acquisition. So we want to import that compensation that we just exported from that other layout we were working on earlier. So I'm going to just right-click. Okay, and again, these mouse over hints will help you as well. If I mouse over this folder, I could import it that way. You see it says import a compensation from a file, okay? Or you can right-click in the window. That'll give you the menu you want as well. So I'm going to do import. And here on my desktop, you can see that file that we just created here, webinar compensation.compensation. So let's import that. Okay, and there it is, the compensation matrix, and everything is there, spillover matrix, etc. So I'm going to show you the method that we used before. I'm just going to right-click and apply to all plots, and you can watch carefully the populations and the plots at right update. Okay. There's yet another method of exporting compensations, and that is to assign to a data file. So if you mouse over, for instance, this button here, or again, if you right-click and go to Assign to File, what that is going to do is give me the option to assign this compensation to a data file so that in any future layout where I open those data files, it'll be automatically loaded into the plots for those files. Okay, so let's go navigate to the files that we want to assign the compensation to. Okay, so maybe I want to assign it to data file 1 and data file 2, but not data file 3. Okay, so let me just click open, and so now it has assigned. So let me show you what that looks like in your Windows Explorer or your Mac documents folder. You're going to have your original data files, data file 1, 2, and 3.fcs, but then you'll also have a .compensation file for the data file 1 and a .compensation file for the data file 2. And it's prefixed with the same file name as the data file. And so what that means is anytime in FCS Express, when you load in those data files, as long as you have the appropriate default option or preference in place, it's going to associate this compensation with those data files. Okay, so let's open up a new layout and we're going to test that out. And I'm going to put in a dot plot of that file. We'll start with data file 1. Okay, so now if I right-click and go to compensation, you see this time it says datafile1.fcs.compensation. And so that's the compensation that's going to always be associated with this data file. I could go to the next plot, data file 2. Again, that compensation is there. And I could go to the next file, data file 3, and that compensation is absent because I chose not to associate it to data file 3. Okay? So that's another handy way to work with compensations in other layouts. And let me come back into my options and show you which preference I have in place now for that to work. So this is working because I've set the compensation default and FCS file. And so those, when you assign to a file, it's technically read sort of as metadata keywords. So it's read by FCS Express as an FCS file-derived compensation, as sort of as if it had been created at the time of acquisition. So if you don't have a compensation default manually set, remember we right-click and set as default. If you don't have that, it'll automatically apply that compensation that we assigned to file. But the manufacturer default, i.e. this is the setting that FCS Express comes to you as if you don't change it, FCS file and compensation default, that will also work. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that one. See, even under that preference, that compensation that we assigned to the file is still there. Do you all have any questions about that so far? Is that all making sense? Okay. If you have any questions, just feel free to enter that into the questions and answer box. Okay? So let's jump back to, remember I mentioned I was going to show you an example of an experiment where you need to use this step 3, adjust parameters for when you have cells and beads or some other mixture of sample types for your single stained or unstained controls. Now that we understand how to go through the basic workflow 1 through 5 of setting up your automatic compensation, let me show you how to actually work with that step 3, because occasionally you might have to do it. So before I launch into that, I see one question asking if the cytometer you're using doesn't have a compensation or doesn't apply a compensation to the files, then should you have the option set up as compensation default? Yeah, I would say that's a good option, but you could even leave the option alone because the default option of FCS file, then compensation default, since there won't be any FCS file-derived comp in your case, it'll just automatically try to apply the one that you manually set as default. So either way should be fine. Okay, so this is again the auto compensation setup that we already understand how it works. I'll just click on it to refresh your memory. So the user here put in their single stain controls, and we can click through and see all of the parameters. So basically in this experiment, most of the parameters here are on beads. Okay, you can see from that scatter gate that that's on some beads. Okay, so these all look fine. That looks fine too. But this one here, this last parameter, V500, doesn't have any data in this plot. And that's because the V500 parameter, the single stain control, was actually created on cells. Okay, so let's look at forward scatter, side scatter. Okay, and we can even show that original scatter gate. So you see there's nothing in this scatter gate, and that's why this plot is empty, because it's gated on scatter gate. So how do we account for this? How do we still use the auto compensation setup when we have cells and beads? What we'll do is we'll draw a new gate around our cells. Okay, we'll call it cells. Okay, and then there's a couple of different ways. Let me show you one way to do this. You could, if you wanted to, insert a new plot of the cells. Okay, and then we'll change this to V500, and I could draw a couple new gates. Okay, and I'll call this positive, and I'll draw another gate here around the negative or the unstained. Okay, and then you could use this step 3 stained and unstained columns to drag these gates over. So I'm going to drag my positive gate here and override the automatically created marker there and drag the negative gate over. Okay, and then I could calculate the matrices. All right, so you see then that gets calculated. Let me undo that because I'm going to show you an even quicker way to do this. Just going to get rid of the extra plot. A better way to do this is to click on the cells gate and we can drag it over to apply it to this histogram at left. Okay, and now you see we have the markers auto-detecting the peaks quite well. All right, now if I try to click calculate matrices, I get an error message. And it just says there are problems with the automatic compensation calculation. The mean or median of the selected data for V500 cannot be calculated. That's just because we need to adjust our hierarchy now. So I'm going to grab this V500 stained and unstained gate and drag them so that they're child gates of that cells gate. And now when I click calculate matrices, it calculates just fine. Okay, so you can see our spillover matrix there, our compensation matrix. And then you can just apply that compensation just like I showed you before. Okay, there's no difference. It's a compensation matrix like any other at this point. Okay, so do you all have any questions? That's pretty much all I wanted to show you today. You know, there's lots of other things you can do. There's probably other methods that you can use to accomplish your compensation in FCS Express, but I'm showing you some of the most typical workflows that you'll probably encounter, and this is the best practice in a lot of cases, okay? But if some of you are doing it in a different way, that doesn't mean it's wrong. If you have some questions, just feel free to email us, and we're happy to help you, okay? So just to wrap up, hopefully what I've shown you today is that FCS Express can easily view and edit your existing acquisition-derived compensation. It can create a new post-acquisition derived compensation, either from scratch with the sliders, or the recommended way, of course, is using your single stained and unstained control if you have one. And you can apply the compensation matrix, or you even have the flexibility to apply multiple matrices to various samples within your layout. Okay, so whatever you need to do regarding compensation, you can certainly do in FCS Express. And we encourage you to write to us, whether you're an existing or a prospective customer. You can write to us anytime. We're happy to help you. You can either write to us at support@denovosoftware.com. Let me just jot that down here. And we endeavor to answer all questions within 24 hours for sure. Many times much quicker. You'll get an answer within a couple of hours or even an hour. You can also click here. If you have the software open, you'll have this nice startup screen, and you can click on the support button here, and that will take you out to our website where it has a link to that email address I just mentioned to you, support@denovosoftware.com. You can also call and leave us a message or talk to a live person. Another thing we encourage you to do is to schedule a live help session with us. And you can also do that just by writing to us at support@denovosoftware.com. But you can click on this link, and that'll open up an email to request a live help session where we can help you troubleshoot your layout in terms of compensation or anything else on a live screen sharing meeting, much like this webinar today, except that you'll be able to talk as well, and we'll be able to share screens. Okay. We also have other help resources. If you have the software open, you can click on Help and Manual down here, and that will launch a written version of our manual. And we have the video guide up here. So if you click on Video Guide, it's a bank of short 2 to 4 minute videos. I believe there is one here all about compensation. It's the second to the last one. And that'll go through in about 3 minutes, just launching that 5-step auto compensation feature that I showed you. Okay. Again, coming back to our website, you can click on, under support, you can click on manual. Okay, and just to show you the compensation tutorial, if you scroll down, there's the compensation tutorial right up here. And this will take you through a workflow with some of our sample files that you can download from our website. Okay, so that's nice if you like step-by-step written instructions. You can also just search for compensation and see what comes up. So there's a lot of written resources for you there. Okay, so the documentation is pretty complete online. All right, and for those of you who haven't downloaded FCS Express 6 or don't have a purchased version, we encourage you to come to our website, novosoftware.com or fcsexpress.com, and under download, you can click on FCS Express demo and download the demo. Okay, so we encourage you to do that even if you have an earlier version of FCS Express, because I think you'll find that working with your data files is a lot faster and the user interface in version 6 is really, really nice. Okay, so I'll keep the webinar open for a few more minutes if there's any follow-up questions. But if not, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure having you, and we hope to see you at some of our future webinars, which, by the way, if you go to support webinars, are down here, and you can click on upcoming webinars and see that we still have a few more webinars coming up this season. Okay, thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.